you're about to experience is one man's quest to see beyond the tumultuous period we're in and to envision what lies just beyond our grasp, yet well within our reach. Welcome to Larry Rifkin's America Trends, where the future has arrived, and it's just in time.
Welcome back to America Trends. Larry Rifkin along with John Krofsik. And John, no one can say that we don't take on the tough topics when necessary as we set about to understand societal change and disruptions to what should be the normal order of things.
Well, that's for sure. And this topic is very shocking. And to me, it went on for too long with nobody doing anything about it. That's what really shocks me the most. It was allowed to go on and on and on.
How can an institution, and of course we're talking about the Catholic Church, and we're talking about child sexual abuse within, how can an institution, I can't understand this, founded on faith and trust, allow its most respected leaders to abuse children for so long with so little consequence? Yeah. How does that occur?
Well, it occurs because of there's no transparency in the church. I mean, let's face it, they covered this thing up since at least the 1950s that we know about, and it's just horrible.
Well, we know so many lives have been broken as a result. I know a gentleman who, when the Spotlight reporting came out in Boston, and of course the Archdiocese of Boston, so powerful, and that's why it was amazing that the Boston Globe would even take on the church. I mean, there wasn't much more you could do to get yourself in trouble if you were the publisher or the editor of a paper than take on the church in Boston. I mean, let's be honest about that. That's what media is about when it's really performing its task. But this man, whom I knew, who was very adventurous, John, and I think he was adventurous because he was willing to take risks. I think because of all that happened in his life, maybe he didn't think about them as risks because, well, he had a lot of stuff that he was trying to grapple with. So he became something of a daredevil. And he would go out on these looks for these old ships and became an incredible scuba diver, became a pilot and so forth. Ultimately, he had been abused, of course, in the past. And when it all came to the fore and rushed back up in his consciousness, he went out on one of these dives. And what happened is he went off the line. Now, I don't understand exactly how this works, but evidently, if you are an experienced diver, you wouldn't do that. So there was the feeling that he did it with intent. And it so destroyed so many lives when all of this rushed back in. Things that have been suppressed for so many years. Families, I'm sure, torn apart. Relationships, marriages. I mean, the impact of these things is phenomenal.
Well, you think about it. I mean, you trust your kids with these people. You know, I mean, it's broken trust. It's horrible,
and it's very sad. It's very scandalous, and frankly, it's got to stop. And we keep hearing about meetings and synods and conventions and edicts from the Vatican, and this pope being much more responsive than previous popes. But is it really changing? I mean, that's what we set about to answer in this podcast today. And John, we turn to a Jesuit father, Thomas Reese, who is a columnist for the Religion News Service and the author of Inside the Vatican, the Politics and Organization of the Catholic Church. And somehow I got on his mailing list many years ago, and I read his material with intent because he's a brilliant man, and he is not afraid to take on even his own church.
Yeah, he was very good. No, this is hopefully there's more people like him in the church that'll finally get this solved and take care of the people who are hurt in the whole situation.
Well, we welcome him, Father Thomas Reese, today. Tough topic on America Trends. On the line with us on America Trends is Father Thomas Reese, a senior analyst for the Religion News Service. And I must tell you, Father Reese, when I read you, you are such a compelling writer. You are remarkable. And you have tackled head-on this issue of sex abuse within the Catholic Church. And your reporting is some of the best that I've seen. And I want to go to the article you wrote, Taking Stock of the Clergy Sexual Abuse Crisis, Transparency. How important is that, and how much of that has been lacking over the years?
Oh, well, thank you, Larry, for your kind words. Yeah, I've actually been following the sex abuse crisis since the mid-1980s. So, and I wish I didn't have to. But I think it's important because, we want to do whatever is possible to help the survivors of sexual abuse. This should be forefront in our minds at all times because they were so terribly injured and hurt by this abuse that the church has to put them first in any kind of response it makes. And that gets to your question of transparency. Why is transparency important? I think it's important, first of all, to help the survivors in the healing process. They've told us they want to know. They want to see the names of the priest abusers publicized and named because, so much of their experience has been that people deny it. They say, oh, it didn't happen. No, he's a great priest. Couldn't have happened. And for the church to say, yes, there are credible accusations against this priest, this is affirming what the survivors of abuse have been saying. And that is extremely important for them. So that's one of the first reasons for this. The second is, when these names go up, it empowers other victims of abuse who haven't felt, a willingness to come forward. And yet when they see these names, that sometimes empowers them to come forward and say, yeah, and I was abused by this priest too. And that is extremely important, again, for their healing process. And so that, we have a full accounting of what happened. And finally, I think it's important for the people of God and the public at large to know, okay, these are the priests that have been accused. This is what they were accused of. This is how the church handled it. And this is where these priests are today, so that they know, that these men should not be trusted with children. And they know that that they have been dealt with. I think all of this is important, both for the victims and for the church, frankly, because the church is never going to regain its credibility until it is totally transparent and has told everything it knows about this crisis.
Tell us the impact of the credibility of the church as a result of this with its own parishioners. Of course, when I saw the movie Spotlight and I realized how powerful an institution, of course, the church is and has been in Boston, and it was very difficult for the news media even to take on the church. But the church now is much more susceptible to a lot of outside inquiry, I would imagine, as a result of all this.
Oh, there's no question about that. The position of privilege that the church had in the past is gone. Now nobody believes anything a bishop says. They're under suspicion. Nobody's going to say, oh, well, trust us. We took care of it. No, nobody's going to believe that anymore. You got to tell the whole story. You got to make it all visible. And we've seen that. I mean, there are so many prosecutors and attorneys general that have said they're looking into investigating the dioceses in their state or in their territories. This is going to happen. This is one of the reasons the church, if it's smart, will become totally transparent, because if it doesn't do it, then legal authorities are going to come in, take their files, and do their own report on the situation. The days of special privileges for the Catholic Church in cities is gone.
Well, when I read a headline that Francis mandates reporting and has issued the sweeping new sex abuse legislation guidelines from the Vatican City, state, and Vatican diplomats that require the immediate reporting of allegations to Vatican prosecutors, what are we to take away from this? Because I know in 2002, a lot changed as well as spotlight came on this issue, and it went from a sin to a crime and a lot of reporting to civil officials. So where are we taking it now?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I think the church should be grateful to the reporters, to the media that put a spotlight on this issue, this problem, and force the church to get its act together. As you mentioned, in 2002, things changed dramatically in the Catholic Church in terms of how it dealt with abuse. In 2002, they put into place norms and procedures and what we refer to as the Dallas Charter. And most importantly, it said that any accusations against a priest have to be reported to the police, have to be reported to proper authorities. And then secondly, that priest who's accused has to be suspended temporarily while an investigation takes place. And that investigation and any information that's gathered from it, it goes to a lay review board. You know, the days of only the clergy judging the clergy are over. I mean, no profession is good at judging itself. That's why police departments have to have police review commissions. You know, doctors are not good at policing themselves. No profession is. And the church failed utterly when the policing of the clergy was left to the clergy. Now every diocese has a lay review board, and accusations against priests are presented to it. Then the investigation that takes place, what's found through the investigation, is presented to the lay review board, and then the lay review board makes a recommendation to the bishop on what to do with this priest. And and if the investigation finds that the overwhelming evidence is that the priest is guilty, then he's going to be removed from ministry permanently and is never going to be allowed to act as a priest again. This is what we should have been doing from the very beginning. But but the church does have those procedures in place now since 2002. And it's made a world of difference. It has a number of actual abuse cases taking place.
What did the Pope then do? What did he add to these various safeguards in his recent policy?
Well, one thing he did was dealing with the Vatican City state. You know, it's a country in a sense. And its diplomats. For example, we just had a case here in Washington, D.C., where one of the Vatican diplomats was caught with child pornography. Well, he cannot, because he's a diplomat, he cannot be prosecuted by the United States government. So what's happening is he's being prosecuted by the state of the Vatican. And I think, if I recall correctly, I think he was sentenced to 5 years in prison. So that church has updated its procedures and its laws for the state of the Vatican. The other thing, though, is much more important, and that is the Pope called together in Rome last February church leaders from all over the world, the presidents of what we call the bishops' conferences. These are the top bishops in countries all over the world, and had them come to Rome, where they spent 3 days working on the issue of sex abuse and talking about that. Why was this important? Frankly, it wasn't all that important for us Americans, because we've been looking at this issue, as I mentioned, for almost 30 years. Where it was important was for the rest of the world. Frankly, there's a lot of places in the world where the church is where the U.S. church was in the last century. They're in denial. They don't believe this is happening. I've heard from people who were in India just this past year and at a meeting of seminary rectors where they talked about this. And, over the coffee break, rector after rector came up to this person and said, we really don't have this problem here. And They just, they don't get it. And that's why the Pope had to call them all to Rome and hit them over the head with a 2x4 and say, this is a universal problem. Get your act together. It was important for the U.S. bishops to be there and tell them, don't make the same mistakes we made. Get your act together. Listen to the victims. That is so important. And investigate these cases and deal with the priests who are involved in abuse. And I think from what I've heard that, most of the bishops left Rome after that meeting in February, understanding, yes, this is a problem. We need to deal with it in our countries. And we've seen some progress around the world in terms of this. So that was what was extremely important for the Pope to do.
And I know you were critical recently of the past Pope, Benedict. He's still talking and writing about this issue, and yet you don't think that perhaps his words are particularly helpful in this.
Yeah, it was really sad. I mean, the essay that he published and released, it was really very disappointing. And it was especially disappointing because, frankly, when he was the cardinal prefect of the Congregation for Doctrine of the Faith, he began to understand this crisis better than anybody else in Rome at the time, better than John Paul II, certainly better than the other cardinals in Rome. And as a result, when he was put in charge of this problem, he threw hundreds of priests out of the priesthood, after he read their files and dealt with it. The trouble is, this is a man who lives in the world of ideas, and he's trying to blame this crisis in the church on moral theologians that are questioning the church's teachings in some areas of sexual ethics. For example, the scores of theologians that question the church's teaching on birth control. That this somehow opened the gates to sex abuse in the church is that's nuts. We had sex abuse in the church before Vatican II. And in his whole letter, he never mentioned the bad job of the hierarchy in dealing with this abuse, the way in which the hierarchy was involved in cover-up of the abuse and not dealing with it. So I just felt that his letter just ignored the facts in his analysis and who he wanted to blame for this crisis. It's sad. Frankly, the letter reconfirms for me that it was a good idea that he resigned.
You, of course, talk about the role that bishops need to play in this, and many bishops say that listing all those who were accused is unfair. Some of the priests, they argue, are dead and can't defend themselves against accusations. You, on the other hand, say full disclosure means a whole lot more than certain people might think. Where and when the priest ministered, where and when the abuse took place, when the diocese was first informed of the abuse, what the diocese did, where the priest is now. I mean, you want full disclosure.
I think there's no other way out of this crisis for the church. There's no other way than full disclosure. I think that, in the cases where the person is dead, I mean, you just have to say the person is dead, so we don't have his response to the allegations. I mean, I don't know what else we can do, but we can't pretend that this priest was never accused. And when you get, when it's not just one accusation, it's 2, 3, 10 people, then the evidence becomes overwhelming. Now, are there some priests who are accused and unfairly accused? Yeah, sure, but very few. The percentage of false accusations has been very, very small. The most famous example, of course, was the accusation against Cardinal Bernardin of Chicago. The person who accused him later acknowledged that his accusation was false. And it was a terrible experience for Cardinal Bernardin to have to endure that kind of accusation. But, I just don't know any other way we can deal with it than to simply say, okay, these are the people who have been credibly accused. And by credibly, what do I mean by credibly accused? That, if you get, a letter from some crazy who says that the Pope, the local cardinal, and all of the bishops attacked her during Easter service in the cathedral, you're dealing with a nut case, and it can be ignored. But if the person coming forward is not looking for anything, simply wants to report this crime and says they did it, and you find out they actually told somebody about it years ago before they came forward, and that the two people were the person was an altar boy at this parish at the same time the priest was there. It's that kind of evidence, and the person is somebody who is credible and respected in the community. Well, then you just have to say, what this is a credible accusation that if the person would be thoroughly investigated if the person was still alive. That's about the best you can do in these old cases. Civil society would never prosecute such a case because of the statute of limitations. That's an acknowledgement of how difficult it is to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a person is guilty of something that happened so long ago. I think, I think civil society is probably right in handling that in that way, although in the area of sex abuse of children, the statute of limitations has to be much longer than it used to be, because we know these kids don't come forward for 10, 20, 30 years sometimes. So that has to be taken into consideration. But in any case, the church, no matter what the civil statute of limitations is, the church has a responsibility to protect children. Frankly, its standard for removing a priest from ministry is not beyond a reasonable doubt. What we would call moral certitude, that, we're pretty sure it happened. And our responsibility to protect children means that person cannot act as a priest ever again. It's not a perfect solution, especially for people who are deceased and cannot defend themselves, but the church screwed up so badly that I think this is the only way out.
Father Thomas Reese is with us, a senior analyst for Religion News Service. How did this go on so long without either detection or proper response? I think a lot of people are wondering, how could something like this? I mean, I'm tracing this back to the 1950s, 60s, and we're talking about it in 2019.
Yes. Well, I think there are a number of things that were going on. First of all, back in those days, nobody believed the victim. This was true of women who were raped. Nobody believed them when you must have wanted, you must have, encouraged, the assaultant. Well, I mean, this is the cultural attitudes in the 50s and 60s were just against accusers, against the victims of sexual abuse of any kind, either as children or as adults. So people, and priests in those days were on a pedestal. A priest couldn't do something like that. And then, so very few people came forward. Most of the victims came forward after the Boston scandal, because it got so much publicity, and people said, the victim said to themselves, and that happened to me too, and they felt empowered to come forward. They did not feel empowered to come forward until this century. So we had thousands of people who were abused in the past and never came forward because, they just didn't feel empowered to do it, who now feel empowered to come forward. And that's wonderful. That's a great change in our cultures. We've seen this in the Me Too movement. The casting couch has been around for decades, for all of the last century. And yet it wasn't until recently that women felt empowered to come forward and say, yes, this happened to me. That was part of it. And then the other thing was the bishops, if somebody did come forward, and some did come forward and tell the bishop's response was first total denial. He couldn't believe it. And then if he did believe it, it was treated as a sin, not as a crime. And, if the priest came in and said, oh, yeah, I did it, I'm sorry, I'll never do it again, and promised. Well, it was treated like I got drunk, or or something like that. And they thought that they could save these priests, that, they would repent and be sorry and not do it again. And so they would move them to another parish where they'd have a fresh start. It was stupid, just pure stupidity, not realizing that some of these abusers are compulsive serial abusers, and they're simply going to do it again. They will never be safe with children. And so that kind of attitude, and the fact that, the people who are passing judgment on these priests were priests themselves. A cop is accused of using excessive force in an arrest. Well, now, you're going to leave that to the judgment of the other police, whether he used excessive force or not? Of course you can't. Thing with the clergy, you can't leave the judgment of these things to the clergy. That's why we had to bring in the lay review boards.
What does this mean about recruitment and about celibacy? I mean, what kinds of questions are called into play as a result of all this?
Well, clearly, recruitment is an extremely important issue. We got to make sure that the priests, the seminarians who are admitted into our seminaries, are psychologically balanced and healthy. To allow priests into the priesthood who are not. I mean, there are certain indications. There's no psychological test that will say, oh, this guy's going to be an abuser. There is no such test. On the other hand, psychologists like Professor Thomas Plant of Santa Clara have noted that there are certain risk factors that we need to look for. Impulse control problems, brain injury, poor peer relationships, antisocial personality, a lack of non-sexual intimate connections with others, alcohol and substance abuse. These are things you should have an eye out for. And frankly, these are indications of characteristics of someone you would never want to have as a priest anyway, let alone whether it was an indication of the possibility of sex abuse. I mean, these are just dysfunctional people who should never have been allowed into the seminary. So that's extremely important, that kind of screening, and to say nothing of police background checks and things like that before anybody. So that's extremely important. And frankly, there have been a lot of seminarians who have, been able to get in and stay in because the church has such a shortage of priests. And, every bishop is desperate for more priests. And so he keeps giving people second, third, fourth, fifth chances, and people get ordained who are going to just be disasters when they get into their, a local parish. Not necessarily abusers, but people who just can't relate to the people in the pews. People who can't, don't know what it means to be a pastoral priest, to be compassionate and towards other people. So these are all extremely important things. In terms of celibacy, I don't think celibacy turns men into abusive people. We know for a fact that most of the abuse that takes place in the United States is done by heterosexual married men. Mm-hmm. So we should not, 95% of the priests were not involved in abuse, I think is a good indication that celibacy is not the issue. On the other hand, there's two ways that celibacy played into this. One I've already mentioned, the fact that celibacy means we have a shortage of priests. If we didn't have such a shortage of priests, we could get rid of some of these people who were not very good priests. We'd have a bigger pool of people to draw from. The second thing that celibacy contributed to this disaster is that, when it was just priests who were involved in judging these bad priests, they did a very bad job of it. They'd sit around the table and say, oh, he's such a nice guy, let's give him another chance. Each one in their own mind was thinking, what if I was accused? How would I feel about that? If they had been married with children, what would have been going on in their mind would have been, how would I feel if my child was abused? The fact that these celibate men who were passing judgments and deciding who stayed in and who didn't, did not have any children and therefore could not relate to how a parent would feel if they discovered their child had been abused, was a big failing here. So it's not the absence of sex that made them fail in this process. It was the absence of children. Not having your own child and thinking, and going home after work and saying, oh my God, the person that was abused is the same age as my child. That was missing in the process, and that was why it was so important to get lay people involved in the review process.
Just a few more questions. How much has this imperiled the church? Financially, in terms of the confidence that's been shaken among parishioners. How long does it take to recover from this?
Well, the easiest to say is financially. We're talking billions of dollars that the church has had to pay out. I forget, it's something like, I think it may be almost 20 dioceses have gone into bankruptcy. I think, and that's not the end of the list. I think there will be more dioceses going into bankruptcy in the future. So it's had a devastating financial impact on the church. Now, some people say that's great, good, that the church deserved it. I wish. The trouble is, it's not the bishop's money. It's not the clergy's money. It's the money from people, who made donations to the church. And, no bishop has lost a meal because all these billions of dollars have been paid out. But a lot of inner city kids have lost their scholarships because the church doesn't have the money anymore to do a lot of the good things that it was doing in the past. That's the tragedy of this big payout. And it's, I would have rather seen a bunch of bishops lynched and, as punishment rather than this financial. Now, at the same time, I think the church has an obligation to help even help financially the survivors of abuse, to help in their healing. So I'm not going to say they should not get money, but we have to, we also have to acknowledge that this money is not coming from the bishops. It's coming from the people of God. Now, this has also had an impact, of course, on church attendance. We've seen church attendance go down, down, down. Now, it's been going down for a long time. It's been going down since at least the 70s. But we now have, it used to be that Catholics attended church at a much higher rate than Protestants. I think today Protestants now, especially evangelicals, attend church at a higher rate than Catholics. We also see that it used to be that Catholics were about 25% of the population. I think it's now down to about 20%. And the number of people who say they don't belong to any religion is now larger than the number of Catholics. Catholics used to be the largest denomination in the United States. Now, if you could put all of the people who we refer to as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, people who say, if you ask them, what religion do you belong to? None. If you put all of them together and they went out and started a church, you would have it'd be as large as the Catholic Church is today. So this has been a disaster for the Catholic Church. We put the priests and the bishops on such a high pedestal that when they failed, the whole institution seemed to fail.
Just two more questions. To the victims, pastorally and financially, what is the responsibility? I know it takes money away from current obligations to current parishioners and young people and the like, but what is the responsibility of the church to them?
Well, the first thing is to say, we're sorry, we're sorry, we're sorry. Apologize, apologize, apologize. We need to apologize for the rest of our lives for what happened to these children. Secondly, we need to listen to them. I think every parish in the country should allow the survivors of abuse to get up and speak about their experience from the pulpit. They need to be allowed to tell their stories, and we have to listen to them. And then third, I think, whatever we can do to help, whether it's counseling or therapy or what it is, and what it costs, we need to do that to help them. I just think that's absolutely essential. Everything we do, we have to say, how will this help the victims of abuse?
Finally, Pope Francis. Recently, he acknowledged a history of male domination and sexual abuse of women and children, and repair its reputation among young people or risk becoming a museum. I mean, he's a very direct individual. As you look at his tenure and what may come from it, what additional reforms do you think we'll see under this Pope in relation to the issue we've been discussing?
Well, I think the Pope has really taken the church in a good direction. The most important thing is that he gets the support of the other bishops and the clergy. The trouble with the Catholic Church in the United States today is, people who are enthusiastic about Pope Francis, who like what he says and like what he does, if they go to a Catholic church, the likelihood that they hear Pope Francis's voice from the pulpit is about 50-50. And, there are a lot of priests out there that just don't like Pope Francis. And that, they think he's leading the church astray. This is a disaster. We need to get these priests on board. We need the bishops all on board supporting the reforms that Pope Francis has tried to initiate. So I think that's extremely important. There's one other thing that the church needs to get its act together on, and that is how to deal with bishops who don't do their job, how to deal with bishops who don't enforce zero tolerance of abuse, how to deal with bishops who cover up or just move a priest from place to place. We have to have a zero tolerance for that. Now, the Pope has removed a number of bishops that didn't do their job. But, there's like 5,000 bishops in the whole world. And he needs a system for dealing with this. Right now it's being dealt with on an ad hoc basis by the Pope. We need a system. For example, it'd be nice to have a 1-800 number or whatever. If you think the bishop isn't doing his job, or if he himself has been involved in abuse, it should be very clear how you go about reporting him. And then the church has to have some kind of procedure for investigating these kinds of accusations against bishops. And then finally, if the bishop is found guilty, we've got to be punished, got to deal with it. And, and if necessary, removed from office. So we don't have that in place yet. There's a number of proposals that have been floated. There's no consensus on which way to go with that. We need to move on that because people will not be happy until there is a procedure in place.
Father Thomas Reese, I can't thank you enough. What an incredible writer. You really need to start reading the material that you are generating. Really, it's amazing. Senior analyst for the Religion News Service. An honor to have you with us today and discussing a very difficult topic. And we thank you so much for being part of America Trends.
Good to be with you, Larry.
Thank you.
Hey, Larry, I got some exciting news.
Well, let's hear it, John.
We are now part of the MHNR network.
Really? Where can you find the MHNR network?
We can find us at mhnrnetwork.com.
Let's go there right now.
All right.